Hey, also to finish up the spinal cord and nerves, we'll do a bit on reflexes. Then we'll move into nerve anatomy and finish with the nerve plexuses. So when we talk about reflexes, this is kind of building off of what we finished with in the earlier spinal cord video when we looked at a cross section of a spinal cord and how sensory information comes in, get processed, and motor commands go out. But what is a reflex? Well, it's a rapid, predictable motor response to a stimulus, right? Predictable, so something the same always happens and it happens very quickly. Now remember, motor can refer to any type of muscle movement or if a gland is activated. And these are important clinically. You can check for these on a patient to help you figure out whether or not there are certain nerve damage or neurological issues. And we won't get into that much in Bio 5, but in future courses, you may need to learn more about that. You can classify reflexes as spinal reflexes and cranial reflexes. And as some examples of reflexes you're already familiar with, the patellar tendon reflex occurs when a physician taps you on the patellar tendon with a hammer, a little mallet, for example, and your leg kicks out. Although, really, what that's doing is just testing your ability to really like balance and steady yourself. Yeah, so as you're walking, you need these reflexes to suddenly, like, I don't know, if you step on something and you lift up a foot, immediately your other foot has to take that extra weight. So that's the type of reflex we're talking about here. Withdrawal reflex is like the burning your hand on a hot stove and pulling your hand off. We call the withdrawal reflex. And the pupillary reflex is when you have a light shined into your eyes or you enter a bright room and your pupils constrict. And there's also something called the consensual pupil reflex, which is if you shine a flashlight in one eye, that pupil should constrict, but so too should the other pupil. That's the consensual pupillary reflex. So all kinds of cool stuff. There's lots of reflexes that you can learn about. And in fact, if you want to know about more of a couple of those I just mentioned, and you haven't found yet the Registered RN YouTube site, it's pretty good. She's funny-ish, and not as funny as I am. And she has these videos on here. You can see, of course, the pupillary reflex and the patellar reflex. But what we'll talk about before we move on is that reflexes can be classified in many ways, not just what we mentioned previously, that there are spinal reflexes and cranial reflexes, but in lots of ways. So let's talk again about the pupillary reflex as an example. The pupillary reflex is an innate reflex. So it's built into our genes. It's not something that's acquired or learned. It's a visceral reflex or an autonomic reflex. It happens automatically. And when you think of things happening involuntarily, you should be thinking, oh, cardiac muscle is involuntary, smooth muscle is involuntary, and what our glands do is also involuntary. So the pupillary response is in visceral reflex, not a somatic reflex, because that would involve skeletal muscle. The pupillary reflex is polysynaptic. It just means, for shorthand, you can kind of think of it as like it's not that fast. There's multiple synapses that have to take place to deliver that message. It's not as fast as a monosynaptic reflex, which would just be two neurons involved in sensory information comes in, and immediately, with no integration, no processing, no thinking about it, immediately a response occurs. That would be a monosynaptic reflex. And then last, because that reflex occurs and is processed in the brain, as is most of the reflexes involved in your face and head area, that is a cranial reflex. But if you think about this patellar reflex, that's different in a lot of ways. It still is an innate reflex, but it's a somatic reflex because it's skeletal muscle. It's monosynaptic. It happens almost instantaneously. And it's a spinal reflex because we're talking about stuff happening like if you step on something sharp and you have to take that weight on the other leg. That's all occurring down in your spinal cord, is where the spinal cord processes that information and sends out a very fast response. Although in this case, it doesn't even process the information because it's monosynaptic. So All of these are ways to categorize nerves, reflexes rather, and they're not mutually exclusive, of course. So each reflex you would basically pick from each column, and you would say it's one of these, or one of these, or one of these, or one of these. When you think about the wiring in your body of a reflex, we call them reflex arcs. And you have a sensory receptor on one end of this arc and an effector, some kind of muscle or gland, on the other end. And reflexes take place in 5 steps that you can read through here, but I'm going to pull up the diagram and we have our same 5 steps shown. In this arc, right, this is kind of like an arc shape, we start with the arrival of the stimulus and activating some kind of sensory receptor. In this case, we've got a pain receptor being stimulated. So the receptor will activate a neuron to actually carry that information into the central nervous system. So here we've got that information coming in, and look, building off of our cross-section of the spinal cord from before, we can see all the usual suspects, the H of gray matter, the white matter columns, the dorsal root ganglion, and so on. So when that information arrives, number 3 is information processing. So depending on the reflex, you'll have lots going on here and not so much going on here, but the information is being processed in the central nervous system, maybe in the spinal cord, sometimes in the brain. Obviously, this drawing is showing a reflex arc of a spinal reflex, because it shows the spinal cord is doing the processing. And here we have this interneuron that's going to help decide what to do here. And you see a little branch going into the white matter. So the interneuron, it's going to tell the brain what you're up to. It's also going to decide maybe to send out a motor command, but it'll tell the brain what you did. So if a reflex action is warranted, the interneuron will stimulate a motor neuron. So that's step number 4, which will travel down to the effector. And step number 5 is that the response by the effector. In this case, to remove your hand from that pain stimulus by flexing your elbow. Now remember, of course, this is just one kind of classic example of a reflex, but you have these visceral reflexes happening all the time in your body. You've got all this information coming in from your organs. You don't even have to think about it. This process is going on constantly, and the effector might be some smooth muscle in your digestive tract. It might be some reproductive function. It might be some glands being turned on or off, and all of that is occurring in a similar manner. Okay, let's move on to nerve anatomy. This is going to be pretty short and sweet. We've talked about that there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves branching off the spinal cord, 8 cervical and 12 thoracic, 5 each of lumbar and sacral, and you have a single coccygeal nerve. So that's 31 total. And if you take any one of these nerves and you look at these spinal nerves, you'll see that there are bundles and bundles within the bundles. And hopefully this is reminding you of muscle anatomy. When we looked at a skeletal muscle, we had a similar kind of construction. So in this case, the nerve is wrapped in a connective tissue layer called the epineurium. Muscles were wrapped in the epimysium. And then when you cut open a muscle, you found a bunch of fascicles. And look at this. Here too, these are fascicles. We're using the same terminology. So fascicles. Each fascicle is wrapped in a perineurium. Each fascicle in muscle was wrapped in a perimysium. And then if you open up a fascicle, you see a bunch of fibers, nerve fibers. We just mean neurons, the axons of neurons. So each of these nerve fibers is wrapped in connective tissue called endoneurium. Each muscle fiber was wrapped in connective tissue called endomysium. So if you remember that structure of skeletal muscle tissue, this should be pretty straightforward. This is just a second diagram. This is the new diagram from the book that we sometimes recommend. I like the previous diagram better, but here's just another way to look at it as an entire nerve. being bundled, made of a bundle of fascicles, each fascicle being made of a bunch of axons of neurons, nerve fibers. And here's one single nerve fiber coming out, one single axon with some Schwann cells on top. Okay, our last topic is these nerve plexuses. These are branching networks of interconnected nerves, and we're going to see what they look like. But all of the ventral rami, remember from a previous video, there's a drawing that showed a ventral ramus and a dorsal ramus. So all of those ventral rami have these nerve plexuses, except the thoracic region does not. And we'll see why and what that looks like in a moment. So interconnected nerves, you've got one up in the neck, one in the arm area, one in your lower back, and one down towards your sacrum. And the advantage of having these nerves all intertwined is that if you sustain trauma or damage to one of those branches, you still may be able to send sensory and motor information through a different pathway within that network. So let's look at the cervical plexus first, found in the first 5 pairs of spinal nerves. This plexus innervates the skin and muscles of the neck and shoulder, so that makes sense based on its name. And we'll just learn one critical nerve from that plexus called the phrenic nerve. Phrenic literally means diaphragm, and so it's going to and from the diaphragm. To and from, meaning it's bringing sensory information from your diaphragm, and it's sending motor commands to your diaphragm. Right around C4. So if we look at that here, here's the cervical plexus. So that should look like to you an interconnected network of nerves. And you can imagine perhaps that if any one of these little branches got cut, you may be able to find a separate path to send that information. And down here, the phrenic nerve, there's just a little information on here, but it's repeating the fact that this nerve is headed towards the diaphragm. And there's an old saying, well, I don't know if it's an old saying. There's a saying, C4, breathe no more, meaning if you sustain damage in or about the 4th cervical vertebra, you can affect this phrenic nerve. And if you damage or sever the phrenic nerve, and you can't tell the diaphragm to contract and relax, then you breathe no more. Here's a brachial plexus, and it's kind of dissected out here in a cadaver view. This plexus innervates the pectoral girdle and the arm. And we'll talk about a few of these nerves, but also the fact that this may look like kind of a mess, but in actuality, there's a organization here that if you look on this diagram, you can see that we start with these rami, and they follow this progression of branching and breaking apart and branching back together again and again, and they form these trunks, divisions, and cords before you eventually get the nerves. So if we look back here, there are some trunks and some cords that you'll want to look at. This is mainly for a lab topic, but I put little boxes around the trunks, superior, middle, and inferior trunk, and a box around the cords, lateral, posterior, and medial cord. So you'll see these on lab models. They're just an organizational system for this plexus. And we didn't add on the divisions. There's even more different branches here. But the point is eventually each of these are going to go to their own place in your pectoral girdle or upper limb. And we don't care about all these nerves. We just want to talk about a few. The musculocutaneous nerve allows you to flex your arm and forearm. As this name would imply, it not only sends muscle commands, but it's going to the skin. It actually brings sensory information back from your skin in your arm and forearm. The median nerve innervates the flexors of the wrist and fingers. Axillary innervates some specific muscles, deltoid and teres minor, right? Teres minor in the back of the armpit region. The ulnar nerve innervates the flexors of the wrist and fingers, and the radial nerve innervates the extensors of the arms, wrists, and fingers. So you want to kind of think back to your muscle and or bone days and try to trace these out in your mind as you look at your arms. But realize also that as you learn what muscles are innervated by these different nerves, you can, well, for one, you can pretty quickly start to diagnose nerve damage if you knew all the nerves and everything they innervated, although that's a lot. But also keep in mind that you'll know that all these areas also have sensory information from the skin in those regions coming back into the spinal cord. So all of these nerves also carry sensory information back in. So a loss of feeling in some parts of the body could also correspond with a loss of muscle control to those regions. And here's a little bit more detail. We just picked a little bit of what is innervated by each of these nerves, but there's much more that you can look into if you so wish. We did say that there's no plexuses in the thoracic area, but there are spinal nerves branching off the spinal cord down through the thorax. So what are those doing? They're just kind of branching out throughout your chest region. If you look at this image, there's a bunch of those nerves labeled, but I just really wanted to show you how that they are branching out. There is innervation for your whole thoracic region. And some of the things they're doing are, for example, being involved in respiration. Like your intercostal muscles, which you should remember learning about, those assist in respiration. They help the diaphragm. So as one of the things that these nerves do is they aid in respiration. Okay, we've got a couple more plexuses. We did cervical and brachial. Now we're looking at the lumbar plexus down in mostly in the lumbar region. And these nerves are going to innervate your lower abdomen, and we're getting into parts of the thigh. So we'll look at just two in detail. The femoral nerve innervates the flexors in the hip and the extensors. And the obturator nerve innervates the adductors of the leg. Now, just like we've been learning before, these nerves also are carrying sensory information back in from the skin and from those regions. And here's the lumbar plexus with all of the intertwining nerve networks shown in full. Lots of different nerves here in the list. We're just looking a little bit at the femoral and obturator nerve and the functions of each. And we finish with the sacral plexus, down in the sacral region, innervating the thigh. And the biggest nerve in your body, called the sciatic nerve, is found in the sacral plexus. So S for sacral, S for sciatic. And that big fat nerve travels down your leg, and it branches into the tibial nerve, which innervates the hip extensors, leg flexors, foot flexors, and toe flexors. And the common fibular nerve does the extensors in that region. Again, these nerves are gathering up sensory information from those regions, and they're transmitting that back into your central nervous system. So now we've looked at spinal cord anatomy. We've talked about how reflexes work, the anatomy of nerves, and these nerve plexuses, and started to study some of the specific nerves. And quite a bit of this you will see is repeated within your lab models, looking at the cross-section of the spinal cord, looking at the nerve boards where you have a whole human figure and you can trace some of these nerves on there. So make sure you're integrating this, because several chunks of this are kind of trending more towards lab type information, although you'll see some references to it in future lecture examinations as well. Bye.